Welcome to the debate. So I want you to imagine an aviation engineer, and they're tasked with designing the autopilot system for, a massive new commercial jet.
Okay.
And on paper, it's a brilliant piece of engineering. But there's a catch. The board of directors has decided that acknowledging the existence of ice accumulation is actually bad for the company's brand.
Oh, wow. So they just ignore it?
Exactly. They literally forbid the engineers from programming the sensors to even detect ice. So they end up building this incredibly complex flight system based on like an idealized, perpetually sunny version of the weather.
And I'm guessing that doesn't end well when they hit actual weather?
Right. The moment the plane flies into its first real winter storm, the system cannot compensate for a variable it isn't allowed to see, and the plane crashes.
Yeah, well, and the thing is, the system doesn't fail because the underlying math of the autopilot was flawed. It fails because the foundational assumptions deliberately excluded of a very dangerous, very uncomfortable reality.
Precisely. The engineers were basically forced to choose a pleasant fiction over a difficult truth.
Which is exactly the dynamic we are impacting today. We're looking at recent theoretical arguments in political philosophy and jurisprudence regarding what the source material calls institutional blindness. We are really examining this profound tension between institutional self-censorship, what, many colloquially call political correctness, and the absolute necessity of confronting uncomfortable realities in law, academia, and public policy.
Right, it's a huge dilemma. It is. And I'll be arguing today that when our intellectual and legal elites purposefully ignore taboo subjects, they don't actually protect anyone. They cause institutional collapse and practically invite the rise of radical populism.
And I'll be taking the opposing view here. I argue that the legal and institutional systems have a fundamental mandate to civilize reality, not just, passively describe it. Validating brutal, unchecked discourse about specific demographic or cultural groups under the guise of just facing facts doesn't save society.
You think it makes it worse?
I think it risks institutionalizing prejudice and putting us on a fast track to repeating the horrors of 20th century totalitarianism.
Well, let's unpack the core of this existential threat of institutional blindness, because the mechanics of it are fascinating. When we look at how public policy is actually crafted, its success relies entirely on an accurate assessment of the environment. If you're a legislator or an administrator or a judge, and you are culturally pressured to ignore specific variables, whether those are cultural, religious, demographic variables, simply out of fear of crossing a social taboo, the entire apparatus of governments breaks down.
Because you're working with incomplete data.
Exactly. The source material outlines this as the direct path to wrong diagnoses and ineffective remedies. Think about it mechanically. If you do not identify the actual factual root cause of a social phenomenon, you cannot possibly legislate to contain it.
You just treat the symptoms.
Right, you end up applying these superficial treatments to symptoms while the underlying disease just keeps raging. And this isn't just some, abstract academic failure. When public policies fail in the real world, it generates severe insecurity, economic devastation, and tragically the loss of human life. We are essentially blinding ourselves to the mechanics of our own society and paying a massive price for it.
I understand the gravity of that threat. I really do. And obviously, nobody wants failed public policy. But we have to step back and look at the philosophical bedrock of why the law operates the way it does.
Okay.
The source material brings up a crucial concept here, which is the contrapunto juridico, or the legal counterpoint. Think of the legal counterpoint like a societal gravitational pull. Left to our own devices, human beings have a terrible tendency to pull toward tribalism, right? Toward blaming the other, toward reducing really complex problems to base prejudices.
Sure, human nature can be ugly.
Exactly. So the law is designed to act as a countergravity. It artificially pulls us upward toward fairness, equity, and human dignity. The law is inherently normative. It is meant to elevate society.
But at the cost of the truth.
At the cost of not weaponizing the state. If our institutions begin to validate debates that categorize entire demographic or cultural groups as inherently problematic or intrinsically violent, the state ceases to be an impartial arbiter. it inadvertently authorizes persecution.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following the logic there. You're saying that by simply formalizing statistical observations or, acknowledging a difficult cultural variable, the state is automatically authorizing persecution? Isn't that a bit of a leap?
It's not a leap at all when you look at how state power functions. When the state writes a demographic bias into its official calculus, it gives that bias the ultimate weight of state-sanctioned truth.
Right, but
And we have extensive historical precedent for this. When you look at the 20th century, totalitarian regimes did not begin with spontaneous, arbitrary cruelty in the streets. They began in the legislature and the courtroom.
well, they began with propaganda, yes.
They began by using carefully curated facts and selective demographic variables to systematically dehumanize specific groups. Using institutional power to validate those categorizations inevitably leads to societal ruin. We have an ethical duty to prevent the law from becoming a weapon of stigmatization, even if that means we don't look at every single raw variable.
I hear that theory, but let's look at the street-level reality of what happens when that so-called civilizing silence is actually put into practice. Because we are talking about a massive gap between the public's perception of reality and the idealized reality maintained by judges and administrators.
Okay,
Let me offer a more grounded analogy. Think of a doctor treating a critically ill patient. The doctor knows that the patient has a highly sensitive family medical history, perhaps a genetic predisposition that is heavily stigmatized in their particular community.
right.
If the doctor refuses to acknowledge that family history out of politeness or out of a desire not to offend the patient's sensibilities, they are going to prescribe the wrong medicine. The polite silence literally kills the patient.
I see what you're saying.
It's the exact same mechanism in public policy. If institutions ignore clear patterns, for instance, the source material points to the complex relationship between disordered immigration and localized spikes in crime, they cannot legislate effectively to contain the fallout. The everyday public experiences that fallout directly, while the institutions pretend it simply isn't happening.
I come at it from a different way. The flaw in your doctor analogy is that a genetic marker is an objective biological reality. It is a literal sequence of DNA.
But crime statistics are also real data.
The clear patterns you are referring to in society, like the supposed innate link between a specific demographic of immigrants and criminality, are rarely objective facts in that same way. They are highly complex, multivariable phenomena.
I'm not denying there are multiple variables.
Right, but when you see a spike in crime in a specific community, there are dozens of confounding variables at play. You have historical redlining, generational poverty, lack of access to capital, educational disparities, but it is entirely too easy for society to reduce all of that complexity into a really dangerous generalization. This group equals crime.
But the reduction itself isn't the goal of the institutions. The goal is simply acknowledging that the variable exists and plays some role in the outcome so it can actually be managed.
But the mechanism of government doesn't handle nuance well. By formally acknowledging it at the institutional level, you codify a bias. You are arguing that the risk of omission is deadly, and I concede that failed policy has severe consequences. But the risk of stigmatization is equally, if not more, deadly.
How so?
When the state formally recognizes a marginalized group as a statistical threat, it creates an inescapable feedback loop. The state identifies their group as a risk, which leads to over-policing of that group, which generates more arrests, which creates more data to justify the initial bias.
Which leads to further marginalization.
Exactly, and eventually state-sponsored violence against them. The cure you're proposing, this brutal institutional honesty about demographic variables, is a poison that destroys the civil rights of minorities.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on where that polite institutional silence actually leads us. Because it doesn't lead to harmony. It leads directly to the erosion of public trust. The material describes this specific phenomenon as the vacuum of representation.
The vacuum of representation.
Yes, and if you're listening to this and wondering why your local politics seem completely paralyzed or why voters seem so angry, this vacuum is exactly why.
Because of the void created by institutional silence.
Right, let's look at the psychological mechanics of this vacuum. You have an intellectual and legal elite that absolutely refuses to discuss the realities that everyday citizens are facing.
The average citizen walks out their door, experiences a specific, undeniable social friction, perhaps related to the rapid cultural shifts of disordered immigration, or, a localized breakdown in public safety, and then they turn on their television or look to their institutions for a response.
And they get nothing.
Or worse than nothing. The institutions, operating under that exact fear of stigmatization that you just outlined, refuse to even name the problem. They issue a glossy PR statement about an idealized narrative. At that moment, the citizen feels gaslit. The law loses its legitimacy in their eyes. It becomes what the material calls an ideological fiction.
It is the lived experience of the citizen on the street is completely divorced from the official sanitized narrative of the state.
Exactly. And the foundational rule of politics is that nature abhors a vacuum. This intellectual silence creates a massive, gaping void in the political discourse. And who eagerly fills it? Radical, populist voices.
Right.
Here is the truly dangerous mechanical part of this. These populists manage to completely monopolize the concept of brutal honesty. They don't actually have real solutions, but they don't need them. They have a monopoly on the truth simply because they have no commitment to the established system.
They can just say whatever gets a reaction.
Yes, they don't care about your legal counterpoint. They don't care about the civilizing mission of society. They just point at the taboo subject and say it out loud. The citizen, desperate just to have their daily reality acknowledged, flocks to the populist. This dynamic bypasses the traditional political system and leads straight to civil disobedience and, ultimately, enemy. A complete breakdown of social norms and the ruin of society.
Okay, but?
By trying to protect groups from stigmatization, the elite inadvertently hands the keys of the civilization over to extremists.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the actual mechanical outcome of your proposed solution? You are suggesting that to disarm these radical populists, the mainstream institutions themselves need to adopt this so-called brutal honesty.
I'm saying they need to be honest, yes.
You are arguing the elites should absorb this raw, taboo discourse into the mainstream institutional framework to prevent the vacuum from forming.
I am arguing they should address the variables objectively, yes, to take the weapon out of the populist hands.
But absorbing radical discourse into the mainstream doesn't disarm the populists. It just does their work for them. It mainstreams and institutionalizes their dehumanizing rhetoric.
I disagree. It's about objective analysis.
Let's trace the logic. If a populist is screaming that a certain cultural group is inherently responsible for a crime wave, and the institutional elite decides, well, we better validate this concern and write policy around it so we don't lose the public's trust, the elite has just weaponized the state against that group.
But that assumes the policy would be discriminatory.
You haven't stopped the rise of extremism. You have simply moved the extremism from the protest in the street into the courthouse and the legislature. The enemy you fear, that total collapse of the moral order, happens just as quickly, if not faster, when the state abandons its civilizing mission and begins legislating based on base demographic prejudices just to appease an angry mob.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes that discussing a taboo variable objectively is inherently synonymous with adopting hateful rhetoric. Those are two very different things.
In theory, maybe. In practice, rarely.
But there has to be a methodology for the rigorous, dispassionate analysis of these uncomfortable truths. We need a space to test these hypotheses before they ever become policy. Which leads us to the specific solution proposed in the source material, utilizing the university as a quarantine zone.
The concept of establishing a statute of total freedom within the academic environment.
Yes, a biocontainment lab for dangerous ideas. The argument here is that we must create a designated, isolated laboratory for explosive discourse. A statute of total freedom exclusively within the university environment.
Right.
Think of how a level 4 biolab works. Negative air pressure, hazmat suits, intense protocols, all designed so scientists can study a deadly virus without it getting out into the population. The classroom and the academic journal must serve as that sociological biolab.
Okay, so total immunity for researchers.
Exactly. Researchers must be able to look at demographic, cultural, and religious variables without any fear of censorship, legal reprisal, or professional ruin. They can rigorously debate these uncomfortable truths, run the data,
strip away the confounding variables, and separate the actual objective realities from the dangerous generalizations you are so concerned about.
It sounds...
We quarantine the dangerous ideas in the academy, test them rigorously, and only export the empirically validated, highly refined concepts into the realm of laws or judicial sentences. It acts as a vital filtration system.
A filtration system for dangerous ideas. It sounds incredibly elegant in theory. A level 4 biocontainment lab for sociology and jurisprudence. But I have to question the fundamental feasibility of this quarantine. Is it genuinely possible to contain explosive, taboo discourse within an academic bubble?
Well, historically, the university was designed to be precisely that sort of cloistered environment. It was removed from the public square for a reason.
Historically, perhaps when journals were only read by a few hundred scholars in dusty libraries. But we are talking about the reality of modern information dissemination. The walls of the modern academy are incredibly porous. The massive risk here is what we might call leakage.
Leakage.
Let's walk through how this actually happens today. Suppose a researcher operates under this new statute of total freedom. They publish a highly nuanced 40-page theoretical paper exploring a highly taboo correlation between a specific minority group and social instability. In this hypothetical academic laboratory, it is just raw data meant to be rigorously challenged by peers over months or years.
Which is the very foundation of the scientific method.
But the moment that paper is published, it does not stay in the laboratory. It leaks instantaneously. It is immediately stripped of its academic nuance. The 10 pages of methodological caveats are ignored. It is distilled into a 280-character headline and plastered across the internet.
Well, you can't control the internet.
And who picks it up? It is seized upon by those exact radical populists we were just discussing, who now use the prestigious academic credential to legitimize real-world persecution. They stand on a stage and say, look, even the experts at the university admit this group is the problem. The theoretical academic debate spills out and triggers real-world violence almost overnight.
But if we follow your logic to its conclusion, the fear of leakage means we can never study the virus at all. The juridical and social pressure we see today often kills the debate before it even begins.
Because the debate is dangerous.
Researchers self-censor because they know the institutional backlash is too severe. If we refuse to study the underlying causes of societal decay because we are afraid someone on the internet might misunderstand a white paper, we are guaranteeing that the societal decay continues.
They self-censor because they recognize the lethal potential of their material. The juridical pressure exists precisely because the law and society understand that ideas have physical consequences. When you grant total freedom to explore categorization and demographic determinism, even within the supposed safety of a university, you are laying the intellectual scaffolding for stigmatization.
But it's just research.
The atrocities of the 20th century were not just perpetrated by thugs in the street. They were preceded by decades of objective academic theorizing in highly respected universities under the guise of scientific inquiry. Think of the eugenics movement. It was taught in Ivy League schools as cutting-edge science long before it became the basis for totalitarian policy. The academy validated the prejudice with data, and then the state executed it.
That is a profound historical point, though I would frame it differently. Yes, academic validation played a role in those atrocities, but those 20th century horrors also relied heavily on the brutal suppression of dissenting academic voices.
That's true. They did suppress dissent.
Totalitarianism requires an intellectual monopoly. It requires a system where only one sanitized narrative is allowed to be spoken. By enforcing a new kind of institutional self-censorship today, even with the noble, civilizing goal of protecting marginalized groups, we are essentially creating a different kind of intellectual monopoly. We are creating a system that structurally refuses to see the flaws in its own societal engineering.
It really is the ultimate tragic dilemma of modern governance.
It is. And as we look to summarize our positions in light of this discussion, I inevitably return to the paramount danger of omission. If our institutions, out of a well-intentioned desire to be polite, to be politically correct, or to avoid stigmatization at all costs, deliberately ignore the factual variables driving social phenomena, they abandon their fundamental duty to the public. They misdiagnose the ailments of society.
They prescribe ineffective, superficial remedies. And in doing so, they alienate the very citizens they are supposed to serve. They create a massive vacuum of representation that is inevitably, predictably, filled by brutal populists, allowing society to collapse from within into lawlessness and anarchy.
And I remain anchored to the paramount danger of stigmatization. The law must be a civilizing force. It must be the counter-gravity that pulls us away from our worst tribal instincts.
Right.
If we prioritize a brutal, unvarnished, descriptive honesty over our ethical mandates, we risk weaponizing perceived facts to justify the dehumanization of entire groups. We risk authorizing state-sponsored cruelty. Institutionalizing a hyper-focus on demographic and cultural taboos does not save a society from populism. It simply ensures that the destruction of minority rights is legally sanctioned and carried out by the state itself.
It seems we're converging on the tragic reality of this dilemma. Striking a perfect, mathematical equilibrium between these two poles is, well, it's nearly impossible. Both extremes are fatal.
Completely fatal. Complete silence and institutional blindness lead to a society that crumbles from within because it cannot honestly address its own structural failures.
While unchecked brutal honesty, unmitigated by the civilizing force of the law, historically leads to societies that tear themselves apart through targeted persecution and paranoia.
There is no clean algorithm or easy policy solution to fix it. The tension between truth and dignity is inherent to the ongoing project of civilization.
Which leaves us, and the listener, to ponder the role of the academy moving forward. Can the university ever truly function as a safe, hermetically sealed testing ground for dangerous truths, or are the walls between theoretical debate and real-world violence inevitably too porous in the digital age to ever risk the experiment? We must ask ourselves if we are willing to step out onto a bridge built by an engineer who refused to calculate for the wind. The structure might look perfectly equitable on paper, but the storm does not care about our good intentions. Until next time, keep questioning the variables.